Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to everybody, both here in person and online. I'm Margaret Johnson. I'm the director of the program for Instructional Effectiveness, and I'm really excited to welcome you today to listen to a presentation by Dave Lawrimore, who is going to talk about his great ideas in teaching. Let me introduce you to Dave, who's going to be giving his presentation titled One More Time with Feeling, Cultivating Affective Student Responses. Dave is an associate professor of English whose research focuses on the relationship between literary forms and political ideologies in early 19th century literature. In particular, his focus is on the American novel before 1820, especially its publication and circulation history, its multiple points of connection to other genres, and its role in the class and partisan conflicts of the early national period. He holds a PhD and MA in English from University of Florida and a BA in English from University of North Carolina. This past spring, Dave was a recipient of ISU's annual Outstanding Teacher Award. Dave will begin his presentation, and there should be some time for conversation as well. So please welcome Dave.
Thank you all for coming, especially on this snowy Friday morning. I don't know if I would have gotten out of bed if I didn't have to. So thank you. Yeah, so I should start by saying that this presentation will be pretty informal. This is partially because I've only recently begun thinking through affect as a theoretical concept. So I'm kind of feeling my way around here in the dark. But also, as I'll discuss a bit later, affect tends to lend itself to informality because it's an attempt to understand phenomena that exist prior to definition, classification, or rationalization. So with that in mind, I will open today by talking through my own affective responses to literature and art, which is my own sort of area of teaching. And next, I'll offer a short presentation via PowerPoint where I'll sketch out some definitions of affect and then some ideas of how it can relate to pedagogy. Finally, I'll offer a few narrative examples of how cultivating affective responses in students helped enrich their own classroom experience. So one quick disclaimer here, my training is in literature and art, which we can define pretty broadly, but it might not cover everyone's classroom experience. I'm looking at Michelle, who's a psychologist, and I'm already anxious because our definitions are going to be different. So my talk today is mostly focused on what Sean Nye has called aesthetic emotions, that is feelings unique to our encounters with artwork. However, I hope to leave plenty of time at the end today for a discussion where we can broaden out this to teaching in other disciplines. And I don't expect this to last much longer than 30 minutes or so. So it should give us at least 10, 15 minutes for discussion. So I guess I'll just start by talking out a little bit about my own experience with sort of aesthetic emotions. I remember pretty early on in my life having fairly strong visceral reactions to art, especially if you define it broadly. I think early on, a lot of this had to do with music, which often seemed to generate sort of feelings sort of out of sort of nowhere. I mean, I was going to give a cool example of how I was listening to Radiohead's OK Computer in the mid 90s and how it's got all these sort of feelings that sort of came up from it, but it was also probably Backstreet Boys and stuff too. But I mean, I think we all kind of have a sort of relationship to music, or at least a lot of people have a relationship to music where it just sort of emotions tend to sort of come, or feelings sort of tend to come from nowhere, and I really sort of appreciated that as a sort of way of experiencing affect. But as I got older, and perhaps because I wasn't talented enough to major in music, I began to develop aesthetic emotions more fully in line with literature. And I just sort of two quick examples of reading some works where a sort of affective responses came up. First was in reading James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And I don't know, I know some of you probably are familiar with the sort of hellfire and brimstone sermon that occurs near the end, and Stephen Dedalus's sort of guilt that he gets from this really intense Catholic priest describing hell after Stephen had done some things that were going to send him to hell, and then his sort of breaking through of that, and the sort of euphoria of getting away from that near the end of the book. And as I was sort of going through my own sort of crisis of faith during the time, that book really helped me sort of identify what I was going through. sort of personally. And it also created a sense of empathetic comfort, I think, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. Like, I think we tend to think about sort of empathetic responses to art going outward, that we can sort of empathize with characters, but I think also it goes the other way, and like sort of like I sort of recognizing that Stephen and I had similar experiences, and that sort of validated it for me as well. And so, I mean, like, you know, like, and I was like, that's just sort of one example of many. And another one, sort of relatedly, is reading William Faulkner's Sound and the Fury, and how maybe you can help me with this a little bit. But there's that sort of moment near the end where Benji, who has sort of major developmental disabilities, is sort of screaming, and I sort of was able to, with my sort of minimal literature training at the time, was able to sort of make the connection between that, the sort of Hamlet soliloquy about, you know, the tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, and then that connection to the title, and like, just sort of like the sort of, I mean, again, this affect is hard to define, but there's some sort of like excitement, if not euphoria, for me, for sort of making those connections between works. And so I think, like, and those are just sort of two examples of like how that works. And I think it's notable that these happen in graduate school, some with the help of teachers. I read Portrait of the Artist by myself, but like reading Sound and the Fury was partially cultivated by a teacher in class. But as I entered graduate school, it became clear pretty early on that these sort of affective responses tended to not be part of seminar conversations. For one, we didn't read and discuss much literature, I think. Like, we read a lot about literature, but not much literature itself. And when we did read lit, it was often in the service of sort of larger academic arguments. You know, and for those of us who are in literature can relate to this, like, you know, either in the form of its relationship to sort of deconstruction and cultural theory, you know, sort of like deep philosophical abstractions. It's sort of historicizing this literature sort of within sort of larger cultural formations. And then also just its relationship to issues of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, class, sort of like activist categories. And I feel like it's important to say here, this is not a critique of this or to say that this doesn't belong. I mean, for one, it helped me appreciate what literature can do beyond make me, and I think this is important, a middle-class, white, straight, cisgender male feel something, right? I think for too often, literature was about what men like me thought, you know, and I think like that's a sort of necessary broadening out of the field, and I think it's absolutely essential. I mean, I also think it's necessary professionalization, and the way to becoming an academic or just sort of a professional in any field. You know, I don't believe an individual's unmediated affective response belongs in a peer-reviewed journal article, for example, or I would argue maybe not even in like a classroom essay. But I do think something was lost when that stuff sort of left. So for example, when I reread Portrait of the Artist in a seminar called Joyce in Cultural Studies, a few years into grad school, I was able to appreciate how the novel can be seen as like a Bakhtinian carnivalesque or a polyphony of voices, and established in response to hierarchical hegemony of Catholicism. But like my original emotional response was no longer, I didn't think that was valid. And perhaps more importantly, I had lost sight of my original reason for choosing English as an area of study. And I would say that like this more clinical approach is sort of standard and how I, you know, persisted for me during my dissertation and into my work here at ISU. But I will say that like in recent years, and I think there's a numbers of factors that contributed to this. I think post tenure and just sort of the ability to think a little bit more freely, being a major one, is there's like a number of factors that contributed to my feeling aesthetic emotions more fully. But I think it's worth noting that a lot of this happened for me in teaching. So I think like one of the best examples I have is teaching the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock in Intro to Literature. And I'm gonna try to tell this story well. I was like initially frustrated with that class sort of thinking about this because I think like this is probably generalizable outside of literature, but like, you know, students like really lean heavily into this sort of like literature can mean everything. Like, oh, like, you know, I think it means this and it's therefore right and all this stuff. And that's like, I don't know, like I always tell them like there's no such thing as a wrong answer, but some answers are more right than other ones. And I think in the way that I was trying to do that with them for J. Alfred Prufrock was to talk about internal coherence. Which is how I sort of like work to sort of curb that impulse. It's like, well, your interpretation needs to be sort of internally coherent throughout the poem. Like there is a character named J. Alfred Prufrock, and he is sort of going through something, right? But like we have to sort of make sure it's internally coherent. And I think like in that discussion, it's worth noting that like I had an intense aesthetic emotional response to that. I could just relate a lot to what the character is going through, partially because of what I was going through in my own life, and like like really sort of like the sort of affect sort of came forward in there. And it also happened for some of the teachers. Like it's about this guy who had, and like some of this sort of folds in on itself, but it's about this guy who is like afraid of sort of getting out in the world, and then sort of dies sort of without actually sort of sort of grows old and is never sort of experiencing life. And I don't know, maybe that's like midlife crisis, but I was sort of feeling similar in there. And so like I sort of leaned into that in my discussion with them, and some students could relate to that. And just ended up having a really great class, both for them and for me, where we were able to sort of create like a response, like a reading to this that was actually internally coherent as well, but also sort of based on sort of initial affective responses to this. And I will say that that was a great class. I really enjoyed it. The students enjoyed it. And like I have sort of in that class and in other classes started to sort of restructure it sort of around cultivating affect a little bit more in my own teaching. And that translates well in some classes more than others. And I can maybe sort of specify a little bit more later if that's helpful. But yeah, so I guess sort of keeping that narrative in mind, I'll just talk through a little bit about what affect is and then how we can sort of use it in the classroom. So what is affect? And I'm kind of just really giving just really brief overviews of this kind of in relationship to work by Sean Nye, who is sort of like, she has this book called Ugly Feelings. It came out, I think, in the late aughts, and it's sort of thinking through affective theory. And what's helpful for me is she sort of differentiates it from emotion. I mean, she argues that emotion designates feeling given function and meaning, while affect remains unformed and unstructured. And I think like that's where it's helpful for me pedagogically, is like emotion is maybe a sort of more like reined in or defined feeling, where affect is a sort of broader feeling. And where Nye is especially helpful, I think, is that she doesn't completely like deconstruct emotion into affect. Like she does sort of make the argument that affects are less formed and structured than emotion, but not lacking form and structure altogether. They're less socio-linguistically fixed, but by no means code-free or meaningless. They're less organized in response to our interpretations of situations, but by no means entirely devoid of organization or diagnostic powers. Like I think in some ways it's just a sort of broader way of thinking about this in general. And so why affect specifically and not emotion? And I think a lot of it has to do with what I'll be talking about in the second half, is that it's a response before definition, classification, or rationalization sets effective limits on this experience. It's sort of the initial feeling that emerges before we begin to define it. And my argument is, and maybe this is just for me personally, though I do think in conversations with other people they have similar responses, is that rather than shaping these effective responses, academic analysis frequently impedes or renders them superfluous. Like what people feel about this stuff, how this sort of generates feeling for you does not matter, right? You just sort of block that out and then sort of analyze independent of that. And my argument is like to cultivate affects means to give them shape in the form of a response that is academically viable, as opposed to blocking them out, right? And so it's not to just sort of say, well, and I'll get to this here in a second. It's not to just sort of say like, oh, like, these feelings are superfluous. It's more just like, where can we take these feelings to get to somewhere sort of more academically, professionally viable, specifically. And then just specifically, how does literature produce affect? I think that's one thing that I've been thinking about more recently, less like what affects are produced. Like that is less interesting or important to me than like how I can help generate that or produce that in students, and how I can sort of cultivate it more generally. And I would say that like one way, and I've sort of talked about this already, is through generation, like just coaxing certain effective responses that was felt before encountering it. And I think like in one way is through content, sort of my example of portrait of the artist, or I'm sorry, the example of sort of music just sort of like coming out of nowhere, right? Like I didn't think I had these feelings before, and then all of a sudden they're there. And then another way is through connection, and that was sort of my sound and the fury example, whereas like this sort of like euphoria of making these connections, like when there's this sort of aha moment and things start to lock in, like I think that's like a real thing that's important that we sort of generate for our students. Another one is to kind of validate feelings. It can help legitimate an effective response that already exists. And I think, my reading of Portrait of the Artist in some way kind of did that, and like it sort of validated the sort of guilt that this person had and the sort of euphoria of sort of like giving up on that guilt later on. And sort of relatedly, it can help us empathize or recognize that other people have related effective responses, and I think again, I do think that can go both ways. Like I think like generally we tend to think about literature or sort of content making us like put ourselves in other people's shoes, which I think is very important and something we should obviously remember, but I think it also can go the other way, right, and make us sort of feel more valid in our own responses. Just a couple parameters and classifications before I get into just two examples here. One is I want to distinguish the difference between appreciation versus analysis. Like I think the sort of art appreciation or sort of literary appreciation or the sort of appreciation of a field in and of itself is very important and valid. But I want to make sure that it's clear that like I am not arguing for just like going around and like talking about how these poems make us feel or how this literature makes us feel. Like we want to sort of take those and move toward analysis. And sort of relatedly, so classes are not group therapy, right? And I think again, like that's not my job as a teacher. Like I am not trained in those things, but instead to sort of use those to then guide discussion. And then I also think it's important to note that like there's a difference between direction and cultivation. Like again, like I don't feel that it's my job to tell them how to feel about literature, right? But instead to sort of like listen to what they are giving me and then sort of cultivate that into something else, and I think like, and I don't know how many times like I like really love something and they don't like it. Like it's always that way, right? Like it's never the things I have the most investment in that students are responding to. And so I think like, and I, if I got mad or frustrated at that for them not liking this 1790s novel, I'd go crazy. So so that I think is kind of worth keeping in mind as well. So I'll just kind of offer just two brief narrative examples really quickly. One is sort of like cultivating the anxiety of the unknown versus the security of the known. And this sort of happened in a recent class. I taught in a survey of early American literature, which is sort of literature from contact, so the 1490s up until the sort of Civil War. So pretty broad time period. And like one challenge for those classes that are sort of more historically minded especially is that students have a lot of trouble sort of relating to texts and sort of finding them sort of immediately helpful, or they sort of feel it's sort of far off. And I was teaching this specific example of Charles Brockton Brown, that's this guy here, his letter series, The Man at Home. And just a little bit more scaffolding really quickly. I mean, we were in a unit on the Enlightenment period, so sort of like 17th century Enlightenment. And one thing that we were sort of leaning into are the ways that people in the 18th century were compelled to categorize and rationalize the unknown, to sort of pull during the 18th century especially, to sort of rationalize sort of things that used to be mystified, and that sort of dialectic that kind of emerged there. And this reading fit well into this unit because like Brown is invested in the dynamic of the unknown versus the known in a lot of different ways. Like thematically, he's a Gothic fiction writer primarily, and I think that he's sort of seen as sort of the sort of like a progenitor of American Gothic. And so like you already sort of have that thematically, but he's also really into that narratively. Like he cultivates suspense really well. Like for example, there's like a box in this story and we don't know what's in the box, and it takes like 6 or 7 pages to like they open the box. Like it's this sort of like he's very good at sort of prolonging these things. And so like I was trying to work through like how to make this more immediate for students. And one thing, like one hinge point that was especially helpful here was that like the story was set during the 1793 yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. And so like just really quickly what that is just like sort of major bloodborne epidemic in Philadelphia that killed like roughly 5,000 people. Like, you know, people fled the city. It was really terrible, just this sort of like really gruesome event that, but because it was bloodborne and it was carried by mosquitoes, once it was winter, it just kind of died off. But yeah, so like that, so it was set during that. So obviously, we can sort of like cultivate those similarities to like students' own experience with the COVID pandemic. And so what I did initially was have them sort of compare the sort of narrator's experience of the yellow fever to their own experience with COVID, you know, sort of writing it out first and then sort of talking about it. You know, like I kept the conversation broad initially, but like one thing that kept on coming up was this sort of discomfort of sort of like how in the story, but also for them, like the sort of like, I'm sure everyone in here sort of remembers, unless they've blocked it out, like the sort of like ridiculous, like the not knowing like what was going on in like those opening months, right? Just sort of like, we don't know what this is. It's spreading really fast. Like, are we supposed to get groceries? Like, are all these supply chains going to collapse? Like all of these things that were happening and the sort of anxiety of that that kind of happened there. And then also, and then they brought up this point about like how conspiracy theories like manifested really quickly, you know, and we sort of talked a little bit about the sort of impulse to like why were conspiracy theories so rampant so quickly. I mean, you know, and of course like information dispersal is one of them, but also like the sort of need for explanation, you know, like the reason that, you know, like we could like, if we can explain it, like it takes some of the anxiety out of it, you know. And I think like that's, and we were sort of talking a little bit about that, the sort of like feelings that kind of emerge. Not to sort of say those are the only anxieties. There are obviously much other and sort of deeper anxieties that exist in COVID besides sort of knowing and not knowing, but we kind of like stayed with that after a while. You know, and I even sort of gave my own personal example about I did this thing for a while, like, and I think sometimes it's helpful to like give personal examples, but not in a way that's kind of directive, but just sort of like open up space. Is like for a while, like I cataloged all of Bannock County's cases and like created like an Excel sheet for that. And for some reason, there was like, it was like soothing for some reason to just like be able to see that. I don't really know why, but and so we talked a little bit about that. And so I think, I mean, you know, you guys are probably sort of seeing where this is going at this point, is just like, you know, so I was able to sort of get them to think a little bit about their own experience about the sort of anxiety of the unknown versus the sort of security of the known. And we kind of played that back, right? And sort of like, and then sort of like put it in a couple different ways. I mean, one with Charles Brockton Brown, you know, and how he's able to, if that's something he's very invested in as a thematic throughout his career, how he's able to sort of do that by setting it during the yellow fever epidemic. And also like how that feeling is sort of, how he's able to sort of generate and mess with that feeling with this sort of narrative of suspense, you know, like again, this sort of idea of like what's in the box, like are we ever going to know in the box? And then there's also other stories that he has where like people are walking through the woods and they hear these sounds and they're like, oh, this sound is like clearly this, and then like they feel better for a second, and then there's this sort of like wave of like paranoia that sort of goes up and down, right? And sort of seeing how he's able to kind of do that. And then also, and I didn't talk about this, I wish Matt LeVay were here, he'd appreciate this. He also published it serially, meaning that he would sort of publish it in installments. And so you can sort of see cliffhangers sort of like generating this sort of anxiety. You know, we talked a little bit about that, especially from like season to season now, because like episode to episode generally aren't sort of, they're all released at once, but how like cliffhangers are another way of sort of thinking through this dynamic. And so, I mean, the point being that, you know, like I think like what this helped do, I think, is sort of help make this experience more immediate for them, something that might seem like already established, like the Enlightenment, or even sort of other things that like, you know, people were actually sort of dealing with very similar feelings, like maybe feelings are more universal, or sort of like, you know, sort of like more transhistorical than maybe we sort of give them credit for being. Boy, somebody could really press on that one. And so there's one example. And then another one just really quickly is, and I apologize, I was trying to think of a good title for this, but I think, again, this stuff resists classification. is sort of this idea about like gradual versus immediate paternal feeling, but like paternal being like being a parent more generally, not gendered, I guess. And so what this was is teaching this poem by Kevin Young called Greening, an Introduction to Literature. And generally, again, like the poetry unit in Intro to Lit is like one of the more difficult ones for students, because they sort of find it alienating and hard to follow. More generally, like, there's this real sort of like there's one specific interpretation. Like there's either a million interpretations and they're all right, or there's one and they can't figure it out and they get freaked out. And so like one of the ways I was trying to do that through knowledge was through a lesson on internal structure. That is like how poems can be broken into more digestible parts. And I picked Young's Greening for one reason, because it was helpful, because it's like, even though it's broken into stanzas, like it actually, the logic of it is by sentences that are sort of enjammed across stanzas. And so therefore sort of like forcing them to think in terms of sentences as opposed to think in terms of stanzas to sort of break this up, right? And so just trying to give them an idea of how to do that. But I think like content-wise, the poem is about fatherhood, and especially like how this guy's love for his son or child, I think it's his son, grows throughout the poem. The narrators, who's definitely male, grows throughout the poem. So as we move through it, and again, I shared some of how the poem helped me generate and validate some of my own feelings about fatherhood, like not, again, I think this is not sort of directive to be like, oh, you have to love this poem as much as I do, but more just like, hey, like this is kind of like one thing that comes up for me, just kind of opening up space. And some of the students who were parents did the same thing. It's one of the great things about teaching non-traditional students is you can talk to them about parenthood. And one example I think was especially notable. There was one student who was a mother, who was a fine student, but had not really been engaged for the first, we were about halfway through the semester, and she had not really been fully engaged for a while, but she actually spoke up here and said that she actually couldn't relate to Young's poem that directly, that this sort of like initial feeling that happened, like for Young in this poem, or for the narrator in Young's poem, like there's this sort of like initial anxiety or sort of like distance that then sort of like gradually grows towards this love by the end of the poem. And she was sort of saying like, no, I didn't have any sort of like, it was like immediate for me, just like as soon as I was a mother, like as soon as that baby was born, it was mine, and like these feelings have only sort of like they already existed. And so I think like that, like those are always fun contradictions that then you get to theorize about, right, in the classroom. And so as a class, we begin to theorize why there might be this different emotional response to parenthood. Like, why do I feel this way? Or why does the poem sort of feel this way versus this other response? And like, obviously one of the things that came up almost immediately was gender, right? Or sort of like a mother's response versus a father's response. And we could kind of play that out for a little bit. Pregnancy versus not being pregnant, sort of cultural norms, and all these sort of different things that kind of happen. But I think like what's important is like, and I'll sort of pull this one more time out, is that like we sort of move from a response to theorizing about a response pretty quickly. That it's not just sort of like staying in that for a while, but like, oh, like this, we have sort of now generated a problem that we can attempt to theorize an answer for. And so I encouraged her to pursue this further in her upcoming paper, and she sort of showed a lot of interest. And then again, she wasn't sort of super engaged to begin with, and sort of like was emailing me and wanted to meet with me about this paper. So this was like I had sort of like found an in for her finally, and so we ended up like working together, and with the help of I think Bethany Schultz Hurst, who knows way more poetry than I do, helped find a couple of poems about motherhood, and she wrote a great comparative essay on sort of motherhood versus fatherhood in these sort of two poems, right? And again, like I think this example demonstrates a couple things. Like one, like how we can move from feeling to analysis, like from different responses to a theory about them. I'm sorry, let me read that again. From different responses to a theory, from different sort of emotional responses to a theory about them, to an analysis that is sort of generated by feeling. So the sort of beginning is there. And I think like that create, like having that sort of initial emotional affective investment creates an investment that might not exist otherwise, or sort of like is able to sort of generate excitement for that. And so just by way of conclusion here, I just want to quickly summarize what I sort of see as the benefits of cultivating effective responses in students. So, and this is just kind of a review. Like, one, it helps familiarize seemingly alien content. Like, I think like feeling and especially affective responses can be maybe more sort of universal and transhistorical than we give them credit for. It also, again, like validates students' initial and independent reactions to the content. Like, it's not directive, it cultivates it, right? And I think like that gives students like it sort of, what I would sort of argue is like creates maybe more independent thought than it might otherwise, because they already have an investment in it that they can then sort of pursue on their own. And sort of, kind of related to that is it establishes an investment that they might not have otherwise, and it has them sort of pursue it on their own. And I think lastly, and not unimportantly, is it taps into our own passion for the subject matter. As teachers, like, I don't know, and as I started this narrative, or this presentation with this narrative, like the reason that I pursued literature, one of the main reasons, because I really loved the sort of responses that I got to sort of talk about these things and the excitement that kind of produced from it. Like no person goes into literature to make money, and that had sort of been lost along the way. So like sort of a reinvestment in teaching and in the content, I think, was really helpful for me. And I think like I'm not the only one who has a sort of effective response to that. So yeah, so that's about all that I have for that, but I definitely would love to hear questions and comments from here on. Thank you all for coming and listening. Yeah, Jessica?
That was super interesting. I'm wondering how you might use things like rewriting or posts to kind of get those initial responses so that you can build on them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I definitely think that's oh, I'm sorry. So thank you, Margaret. So she asked like how, like what were Moodle and free writing? Yeah, I mean, I think that those two things are, I mean, just sort of ways of doing it. I do find, like especially for, and the exam, I feel like this works better in intro classes, to be honest. Like this sort of cultivating effective responses more generally. And I do find that like for free, like it's really hard. I feel like it needs a little bit more direction than to just say like write what you're feeling about it. Like I don't know. I think like it needs or more sort of supervision. Like I definitely, like all of these things I generally have students think about independently before they come in. Like I think, for example, like the man at home example was like I had them sort of free write on the top, like or sort of write on the topic of like how are his feelings kind of related to your own feelings about it. And so in that way, I kind of do it. And I do think Moodle posts could be a way of sort of getting that in before class starts. I have found, and I tried to have free writing for Intro to Lit students, and I feel like that actually, like sort of free writing Moodle posts where they just write about whatever they're interested in, and that produces so much anxiety about stuff. Like, and so now I have a more sort of directed response for that. Does that help answer that question? Yeah, Michelle?
So I can see why you're an outstanding teacher. So a few things that you said struck me, like how you help to create this space for students. And that's kind of what I was thinking as you were talking about some of this stuff, is it seems like a point of connection. Draw students in it to make material accessible, because, if they're in class, their first year, second year, they don't maybe have the education and ability to do a full critical kind of analysis, right? So it helps to draw them in. And then it was interesting just now hearing you respond to Jessica's question, and that this can maybe be easier in like the intro level courses, because I'm thinking about my experience in science, and I'm thinking I could do this with upper division classes or graduate classes, but in like an 1101 class where it's more directed, it's like we're teaching them facts, we're breezing through chapters, that would be hard to do. So I guess where I'm coming to is, what would you recommend are some conditions for cultivation? Like, are there would you say kind of a certain classroom size, or you have to have the ability to dig into the material?
Yeah, those are great. Those are great questions. Let me try to
address it however you want.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. I mean, I guess like for me personally, it's interesting. I mean, this might just be sort of discipline specific, but I think actually it kind of tends to work the other way for me in teaching literature, and maybe other people who teach lit can. But like actually, like there's sort of more theoretical grounding in sort of later stuff for stuff, and so I think that's part of the reason why I would sort of say it works a little bit easier for students for like sort of lower division students versus upper division students, is that might just be a sort of a discipline difference. Because I think like also like I really don't want, and maybe this is a way of answering your question too. Like I hope it's very clear. I'm still very much working through this. Like I don't want, like when I was in the first time I taught Intro to Lit was very much like, this is what a metaphor is, and like now we're going to do a thing about a metaphor, and like, and the students were like, oh my god, like, because a lot of it I think like you have to do it as an Intro to Lit thing because you don't have, because I don't know where they're coming from, but like there's no, like that's not what then none of them got into it to talk about metaphor or or synecdoche or enjambment, like. And so I think like, and so that I think is why that's why maybe this will help. Like why I think why it works well in 2211 especially is because they are so excited for and this is like a gateway class, and they are like excited to be English majors, and so like it's a way of sort of taking that excitement a little bit more. Whereas I think like later classes, like they've sort of already been thinking through. Like hopefully they've already been sort of like been moving more towards the analytical, because I do think that's a place they need to end up, but I also think that, I mean, some of it might have to do with just subject matter, like Intro to Lit. And to be honest, like I teach upper division stuff that is really boring. Like it's hard for me to like it's an easier, it requires so much scaffolding when I'm teaching sort of 19th century genre theory and like American fiction. It requires so much more scaffolding to get there that I think like, and that might be part of it too. So I think I think maybe to sort of work my way towards answer your question is like, one way is I think like when you have more space to sort of have, like when you have more space sort of time wise and sort of content wise to allow them to have initial responses is probably one way to sort of cultivate it a little bit better. And I think also a lot of it just has to do with, again, it's not about generation or direction. It's about sort of, like sort of taking what exists. And I think like for some upper division students, they've already kind of moved through towards the more clinical stuff. And I mean, to be honest, I'll have to think a little bit more about how that would look in an upper division class to some extent too. I haven't thought about it as much in upper level classes. So do you have any thoughts on that, or am I allowed to throw this back at her?
Yeah.
Okay.
At least when I'm working with students, as soon as they learn about the DSM, they start trying to read the world and everyone they know. And they have like these, like, that's my dad, and then you're like trying to control that like emotional reaction, So sometimes it happens when they read Hamlet. They're like, oh, Hamlet is, whatever DSM diagnosis you want to pull out. So I was thinking that might be a place where the relationship between like affect and theory.
So yeah, Abraham, and I didn't respond. I'll try to do better about miking my. Yeah.
I'm just going to say this is about. I'm always thinking of rhetorical appeals, emotional appeals that are the most persuasive. Some emotion. So when I have students analyze that, sometimes there is a poverty of understanding of emotion, in the sense that they'll say that something has a particular emotional appeal, but they don't really dive into why. And I'm just thinking this would be helpful to think about. Before we go there, what's your emotional response?
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, this idea, I'm just going to kind of say it again for the microphone, but Yeah, like this, I mean, I appreciate that as like an idea of like, thinking about pathos specifically in rhetorical analysis. And I mean, when I teach, let me say that, and how like sort of diving into that would be helpful. And I haven't taught 1101 or 1102 in a while, but when I teach it, I'm kind of like, yeah, academics don't use pathos. And now it's sort of like, oh, well, maybe that's actually something that we could take some time with, or sort of use it. Because I mean, it can be, when it's done poorly, it can be highly manipulative and easy to sort of see through. Like I use that like Sarah McLachlan and the dogs example, just like sort of cheap pathos, yeah, to some extent, but it's effective nonetheless. And so I think that's probably what's important to keep in mind. Yeah.
I keep thinking about, I've taught our various teaching seminars, graduate seminars, a number of times over the years. It's a lot of, theories of teaching, as well as a lot of practical elements. And yet, inevitably at some point during the semester, because I'm not good at remembering to talk about any affective responses to what they're going to do, but at some point it bubbles up. And there's always just this massive wellspring of terror,
right,
for students as they're reading these different concepts and trying to figure out how to incorporate them, or how they could be able to teach a course at all.
Yeah.
So we end up, it's not like, it doesn't work in the sense of literature, and that you're not responding to a particular art and a theme, but these larger emotional responses to this larger endeavor that you're getting into. And I realized how important it is to spend some time working through those things, and then trying to help them see all the skills they already have, and help guide them through this anxiety. And again, you're sort of negotiating what they know and just don't know they know with this emotional response.
No, I agree that like the affect that is generally prevalent in grad seminars is anxiety, from anxiety to terror. Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually one of the things too, is like, I do feel like a lot of times when I'm just like, how do you feel about this? They're like, I don't understand it. It's freaking me out. And it's just like, I don't know what to do with that. Or, but I mean, I do think that like a lot of times, and that also is like, what affects do we want to cultivate versus not, I think, or like how do we direct certain like other effective responses? But yeah, no, I do think a lot, I mean, definitely I ended up I taught a grad seminar last week or 2 weeks ago where I showed them the MLA job information list, so they sort of get a sense of the market. And there's just like, like immediately there's this sort of fear, and then you have to sort of talk through that with them. And yeah, and I think you're right. And I think the way that I've kind of handled that is the way that you have handled that, which is like it is unknown, but this is what you do. And these are like, everybody feels this way, like sort of empathy. And then also just kind of like, do what you can do, and just move forward. But yeah, no, I agree, especially at that level. That's something that happens for sure. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, from the ether. So I was just reading a book called Doing Emotion by Laura Machiche. I'm not sure how to. Yeah, are you familiar with that one?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting because I kind of shared your feeling that we often exclude emotion from things, and that when we talk about Aristotelian argumentation, we've got like logos, pathos, ethos, and we often deprivilege that emotional response. And so I agree with you that I often erred on the side of like rationality, but as someone who studies like feminist epistemologies and feminist pedagogies, it's been really interesting to me. This book specifically talked about using emotion and affect, and she kind of goes between the two, but has like specific reasons why she would go with emotion versus affect. But she talks about how this is often like kind of a feminist issue that brings embodiment back into it. And so I thought that was really interesting to think about, like encouraging students bringing their embodiment into things. And so she recommends like a whole section where, like, Jessica out there in the audience, I heard you out there, but I'm sure you also experience this a lot in drama classes, where if you have students like perform, get up and move their bodies and really get into the headspace of that person, it really helps with this like affect and emotion sort of thing. So I thought that her book could have used a little more elaboration on how to achieve this in the classroom. So I really appreciated your talk today. So mine is more of a comment, like that I thought it was interesting that this is actually, you could look at it as like a social justice form of energy, right? Where you're bringing the body back into it. You're still privileging the fact that we have bodies, you know, we're looking at materialities suddenly. And I did an exercise with this where I started in my 1101 English class, first year writing. And we did Rachel Carson's Beginning of Silent Spring. She just has a couple pages where she just uses all this sensory information. And I encourage the students to take their paper topics in 2 separate classes I'm teaching and write me something that was coming from their own experience using the 5 senses that had to do with their research project. And the effects that came back from that were overwhelmingly positive. Like the students were like, I really appreciated this opportunity to really put myself into this situation so that I'm not just writing a generic project. Like I'm remembering to put my experience in my life and my passion and the whole reason I'm doing this into my paper. And so we talked about balancing that. And of course, like making sure we're keeping like something like a research paper highly analytical, but that personal experience, like this exercise where I encouraged them to use senses and embodiment, help them get there. So yeah. So if you have any other, go ahead.
Thank you so much. That's great. I'll look into that. That Doing Emotion book for sure. And like there's a lot here. I mean, I guess to start with embodiment, like that's actually interesting that you say that, because like I didn't even make the connection, but like one of the ways that I've found to be most successful in teaching, so the intro to lit unit is like fiction, poetry, drama, and then the most, and Jessica, I'm sure you already knew this, but like one of the best ways of teaching the drama unit is to have them actually act it out. And like I actually had them in class yesterday. Like we were teaching glass bowls, trifles, and like had them thinking about blocking and had them thinking about like you know, like I had one, I was like, no, we don't read the stage directions, you perform the stage directions, you know. And I even had one group of students only do stage direction, not any reading, you know. And I think you're right that kind of, I mean, this idea that it creates a sort of embodiment that then sort of like makes you like it is, and that creates a sort of emotional feeling response that you can then sort of, because like the question always follows, like, why did you make that decision? Why did you move quickly versus slowly? You know, like those sorts of things, and then to sort of help them sort of think it through. So I think you're right, absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot going on with the sort of politics of this. Like I'm really bummed that all my examples, except for Kevin Young, are by like white people and men mostly. And like, but I do think there's a real, especially gendered component, you know, where I think like a lot of the sort of clinical, the sort of new, you know, I think like a lot of this kind of came from sort of new criticism, the sort of like a really sort of deep gendered distinction between like what literature is about thinking and about manliness and about sort of like, you know, like wrestling meaning from it versus, you know, like why literature was popular in the 19th century, which is because like it created sort of like sympathetic responses that people were going through, at least like in American lit. Like, I mean, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which could not be more sentimental, was the best-selling novel for forever. And you know, and then, you know, you could play that out to say it actually like, you know, like was one of the sort of major impetuses to the Civil War. And so I think you're right that like there's a gender component there that is worth sort of mining as well. Yeah. So, and it looks like that book would be a helpful way of thinking in those terms. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and it's just a caveat. It's an older one, but it was just one I found while I was browsing the stacks down here in Provo, and I found it really helpful. So, and she does go into length about like how there are certain categories of people, maybe where we're talking about gender or class or whatever, where we're not privileging their emotional responses like maybe like we should, or even not even allowing.
Oh, that's great.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something is like, I mean, maybe, and, you know, sort of thinking about our students' demographic and how that might actually be more it actually might be more inviting to them on sort of like socioeconomic or sort of race or gender basis than we would even think. Is like, it's like validating something where I think a lot of times they get into college are like, oh, we're not allowed to feel these things because that's not what like upper class people do, you know, or whatever. So yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Dave, so much.
Thank you. Yeah.